Weston Hale walked into Mercer Tower wearing a faded jacket, scuffed boots, and a folder of documents sealed inside a plastic bag to keep off the rain. He had not come to beg for money, and he had not come to cause trouble. But in the eyes of billionaire Von Mercer, a single father with no appointment and no visible wealth had no business standing in the glass lobby of his empire. Vaughn laughed openly when the police snapped handcuffs onto Weston's wrists in front of a lobby full of witnesses. But before they let him out, Weston said only one thing: "Let me make one call." 10 minutes later, the entire Mercer empire began to fall. If you live for the moment an arrogant man finally gets what he deserves, stay with this one until the end. Redwood Harbor was a city that had once smelled of engine grease, salt air, and fish, a working port for 3 generations, home to families who repaired hulls, welded pipes, and ran the supply lines that kept the whole coastline moving. But by the time Weston Hale drove his battered pickup down Harbor Street on that gray October morning, the waterfront was already half transformed, and new glass towers rose where dry dock yards used to stand. Boutique hotels pressed against the chain-link fences of the remaining shipyards, and luxury marina slips had replaced the loading docks where his father had worked 30 years before. The city was being remade in someone else's image, and most of the people who had built it with their hands were watching from a distance, unsure whether to resist or simply accept what was coming. Weston parked 2 blocks from Mercer Tower because the lot closest to the building charged $18 for 30 minutes, and he saw no reason to pay for the privilege of being dismissed. He pulled on his canvas jacket, checked that the documents were still sealed tight inside the plastic bag, and walked the 2 blocks without hurrying, a man who had somewhere specific to be and no particular urgency about arriving, because the work was already done, and what remained was only the delivery. He was 43 years old, lean from years of working in tight mechanical spaces, with a face that had accumulated a few more creases than the calendar strictly required, and a stillness about him that people sometimes mistook for defeat, and that was, in fact, the opposite. He had not slept well, but had spent that sleepless time at the kitchen table, going through every document in the folder, checking every date, every legal reference, every notation, until he was satisfied that everything was in order. Before he left the house that morning, his daughter June had called from 600 miles away, where she was finishing her 2nd year of graduate school. She asked, quietly but directly, whether he was absolutely certain about going to Mercer Tower that day. He told her there were things a person could not leave alone and remain who they were, that silence could feel like wisdom for a long time, before it started to feel like a debt you owed to the people who could no longer speak for themselves. She said she understood, and he told her he would be fine. Mercer Tower occupied the corner of Harbor Avenue and 5th, 40 stories of polished glass and steel. The lobby a study in marble and recessed lighting and the faint sound of orchestral music from hidden speakers. Weston walked through the automatic doors, crossed to the reception desk, set the plastic bag on the counter, and told the woman behind it that he needed to speak with someone in the legal department about a time-sensitive document submission related to the Southern Berth Development Zone. She asked whether he had an appointment. He said he did not, but explained the contractual basis for the submission and the deadline attached to it. She typed, checked her screen, and told him there was no scheduled intake that day. He said the intake he was requesting did not require scheduling because it derived from a standing audit right. She looked at him with the particular blankness that functions as a substitute for dismissal. She told him to wait by the chairs near the east wall. He waited without complaint, watching the lobby move around him, people in precisely fitted suits, women in coats that cost what his truck cost, men who walked as though the lobby floor was slightly beneath them by virtue of their stepping on it. He watched the elevator banks, and he watched the door, and he watched, after about 8 minutes, as a tall man in a charcoal suit came through the lobby with a woman carrying a tablet close behind, and a second man moving with the practiced efficiency of someone whose job was to preempt problems before they became visible. Von Mercer was 61 years old and carried his age the way very wealthy men sometimes carry it, maintained and sharp and lit from within, by the particular confidence of someone who had not been told no by anyone who mattered in a very long time, and who had organized his world carefully enough to ensure that this would continue to be the case. He noticed Weston the way a man notices a smudge on a window he considers his own, with a brief flicker of something between displeasure and assumption, and the immediate certainty that someone else would handle it. Weston stood before the man with the tablet, and the man in the blazer could redirect what was coming, and he said clearly and without aggression that he had documents pertaining to the Southern Berth acquisition scheduled for signature that afternoon, and that those documents needed to be received and logged before the signature occurred because their contents were directly relevant to the legal standing of the contract being signed. Von Mercer stopped walking and looked at Weston the way a man looks at something he cannot immediately categorize and then makes a category for. Local resident with a grievance, probably displaced by development, probably hoping for a settlement that would make him go away before the cameras arrived. He did not say this. He did not need to, because he was accustomed to situations resolving themselves the moment he turned his attention to them. The woman with the tablet, whose name was Autumn Rhodes, and who served as Vaughn's executive coordinator, said nothing, but she watched Weston with a particular quality of attention, steady, measuring, that was different from the dismissal her employer had already arrived at. Vaughn asked, without bothering to moderate his volume, how much Weston wanted, and he asked it the way a man asks a vendor his price, as though money were simply the medium through which all human arrangements were eventually expressed, a universal solvent that could dissolve any inconvenience if applied in sufficient quantity. Weston said he did not want money. He said he wanted the documents received and logged under the existing review agreement. Vaughn's expression sharpened in the way that expressions sharpen when a situation turns out to be less manageable than it first appeared, because people who claimed not to want money were either lying or more difficult than people who simply named a price. And neither category made for a comfortable morning when a $120 million contract was waiting upstairs. The man in the dark blazer, whose name was Lawson Drake and who served as Vaughn's senior legal counsel, had been studying the plastic bag in Weston's hands from the moment he first saw it. He recognized the file notation system, a format used by a specific organization that he had believed was no longer operating with any real authority, a belief he had been cultivating for several years because the alternative required him to revisit decisions he preferred to consider settled. He stepped close to Vaughn and said something in a low, even voice. Vaughn's jaw set. Lawson then said, loudly enough for the lobby to register, that this individual appeared to be what the development industry called a professional interference filer, someone who staged document submissions as leverage for settlements. He delivered this with the smooth authority that lawyers develop for situations where a partially true statement needs to carry the weight of a completely true one. Weston looked at Lawson directly and said that if the documents were what Lawson appeared to recognize them as, then Lawson already knew they were not a settlement play, and Lawson should be careful about the things he said in front of witnesses. He said it without heat, which was worse than anger would have been. Vaughn made a gesture to the two security personnel who had materialized at a respectful distance and told them to escort the gentleman outside. Weston set the plastic bag on the reception counter, deliberately, without hurry, and said to the room that if the documents were not received and logged by 3 o'clock that afternoon, he would be sending duplicates directly to the underwriting bank and to the city infrastructure authority. The lobby went quiet with the specific quality of silence that descends when something unexpected has been said in a voice that does not require volume to carry weight. Vaughn looked at the bag, then at Weston, then at the bag again, and he made the decision that powerful men sometimes make when confronted with something they do not wish to examine. He chose contempt over consideration. He said, with the performance of amusement that passes for wit in lobbies like this one, that a man who drove a truck with a cracked windshield was welcome to send his papers wherever he liked, because nobody who mattered would take them seriously. A few people nearby smiled. Autumn Rhodes did not. Weston looked at Vaughn with an expression that was not angry and not wounded but only patient, the patience of someone who already knows what is coming. He said that if Vaughn believed the documents had no weight, it would cost him nothing to have them logged. Vaughn told Lawson to call the police, said Weston had refused to leave private property, and said it loud enough for the lobby to hear. Weston stood still. He waited, because waiting was all that was needed. The two officers who arrived were professional and unhurried, and the one who spoke first was Officer Bryce Langston, a young patrolman who had been a year beyond the academy and still believed, with genuine effort, that a situation usually told you what it was if you were patient enough to listen before you acted. He had received a call about a man refusing to vacate private property after multiple requests, and that was what he had arrived expecting to find, which made the reality. A middle-aged man standing quietly by a reception counter with a plastic bag, and no visible agitation whatsoever, register as a slight mismatch that he tucked away in the part of his mind he used for things that deserved more attention than the moment currently allowed. Lawson Drake appeared at Bryce's side almost immediately and provided a compressed account of events that was accurate in its individual facts and misleading in its architecture. Weston had arrived without an appointment, had refused to leave, had been asked multiple times to vacate, and had made statements that suggested an intent to interfere with a scheduled legal proceeding. All of this was technically true, in the way that a map of a city can be technically accurate, while leaving out the roads that would actually get you where you needed to go. Bryce listened, looked at Weston, and asked whether Weston would be willing to come outside to talk. Weston said of course, and before he walked toward the door, he placed his identification on the reception counter alongside the documents, face up, in the manner of a man who has nothing to hide and wants the fact of its being visible to be part of the record. That detail, the voluntary compliance, the straightforward placement, was not lost on Bryce, though he did not yet know how to use it. Vaughn Mercer stayed in the lobby, and the staff and visitors arranged themselves around him in the social geometry of people who take their orientation from whoever appears to hold the most authority in a room. He had not needed to plan this particular tableau. It had assembled itself from the infrastructure of his confidence. The kind of confidence built from years of having property rights and telephone calls produce exactly the results he intended. He wore his satisfaction as casualness, framing what was happening not as something he had caused, but as something that was simply occurring in his building to a person who had made a poor decision about where to spend his morning. Autumn Rhodes stood 3 feet to his left and watched Officer Langston's face rather than her employer's, because Officer Langston's face was doing something that Vaughn's was not. It was thinking. Outside, Bryce asked Weston to explain his purpose. Weston gave a clear, sequential account. The documents, the review right, the contractual deadline, the specific provision granting the audit organization standing to compel a submission. He spoke without rushing and without emotion, with the precision of a person who has prepared not to perform but to be understood. Bryce wrote in his notebook. At some point he stopped writing and simply listened. Then Lawson appeared in the doorway and said Weston had made what could be interpreted as a threat, the mention of the bank and the city authority. Bryce asked about it. Weston said he had described legal remedies available under an existing contractual agreement, and that disclosing available remedies was a statement of fact, not a threat. But Lawson pressed, and the lobby was Mercer's property, and the report had been filed, and procedure has a momentum that does not always pause for nuance. Bryce apologized with his expression before he said anything, and what he said was that he would need to detain Weston briefly while the matter was clarified. He kept his voice even. He asked Weston to turn around. Weston did, without hesitation. The handcuffs were applied. Autumn Rhodes, watching through the lobby glass, felt something shift in her chest that she would spend several hours afterward trying to identify, and what she eventually concluded it was, is this. She had just watched a man who was completely unafraid, not because he didn't understand what was happening to him, but because he understood it completely and had already decided it did not change anything about what he had come to do. Vaughn released a short, satisfied sound that was not quite a laugh, but functioned as one. He said to no one specifically and to everyone within range that a man that size was not big enough to create a real problem for him. Weston turned his head and looked across the lobby with the stillness of someone who has already decided that the distance between where he is and where he is going is simply a matter of time. He told Vaughn, quietly enough that only the nearest people caught it, that what had just happened had turned a paperwork matter into a crisis. Vaughn laughed again, louder this time, for the benefit of the witnesses. Before Officer Langston guided him toward the door, Weston made one request: to make a phone call, supervised, before being taken out. Bryce considered it and agreed. The man had been cooperative throughout, no charge had been formally filed, and nothing about the situation required that he be denied something that basic. Vaughn waved a hand from across the lobby and said to let him call whoever he wanted, because nobody Weston knew had any power over what was already decided. Weston dialed from memory a number he had not used in nearly 5 years. The woman who answered said his name before he said hers. He said, "Activate the Whitmore clause. Confirmation code, Tessa 7. A pause settled on the line, long enough to mean something. Then she said, "Weston, if I activate this, Mercer Dominion's underwriting package gets frozen. You understand what that means." He looked through the lobby glass at Vaughn Mercer, still smiling in the middle of his empire. He said, "Activate it." Nothing exploded immediately, which was precisely what made what happened real rather than theatrical. There was no alarm, no visible signal, no wave of panic passing through the building to announce that something had fundamentally changed. Vaughn went back upstairs to the signing room on the 34th floor, where representatives from the underwriting bank, 2 institutional investors, and the Port Operations Consortium were arranged around a long table with coffee and the brisk efficiency of people completing something they had already decided. He came in and said the matter in the lobby had been handled, and the room accepted this, because rooms accept what the person at the center of them tells them to accept, and Vaughn Mercer had been the center of many rooms for a very long time. Lawson set the final signature pages in front of the appropriate parties. The pen was nearly in Vaughn's hand when Brielle Dawson's phone vibrated against the table. She was Mercer Dominion's chief financial officer, careful, methodical, the kind of person who had built her career on the principle that numbers do not lie, even when you wish they would, and she looked at the notification, read it once, read it again, and looked across the table at Lawson Drake with an expression that he had never seen on her face before, which was the expression of a person who has just understood that a risk they were told was negligible is sitting in the center of the table. The underwriting bank had issued a compliance hold on the bridge financing package for the Mercer Harbor expansion, $120 million staged across 4 tranches, pending a priority audit review request filed under the Whitmore Clause by a named co-founder of Hale Meridian Review. Lawson's face changed color in the way that faces change when something a person has quietly decided will never come back has come back. And the color it changed to was not one that inspired confidence in the people watching it. Vaughn leaned toward him and said very quietly that he did not accept complications on signing day. Brielle read the notification aloud. The institutional investors exchanged a look. The port operations representative checked his own phone. Vaughn asked who had filed the request. Brielle looked at the screen and read the name Weston Hale, listed as co-founder and active code holder. The table went quiet in the way conference rooms go quiet when a name that was supposed to be irrelevant turns out to be load-bearing. Vaughn demanded to know how a man he had just had removed from his lobby could freeze a $120 million deal with a single phone call. And the answer, when Lawson provided it in pieces and with visible reluctance, was that the Whitmore Clause was not a technicality. It was a real provision, inserted into the original port development agreement by an independent audit coalition as a condition of their support for the initial zoning approval, and it carried a dormancy that was legal and distinct from expiration. The code could only be activated by a named co-founder. Lawson had classified it as a low-risk item 14 months earlier because he had assumed the co-founder had moved permanently out of the field. He had not verified the assumption because verifying it would have required acknowledging the risk, and acknowledging the risk would have slowed the deal. The institutional investors asked for a recess. The port representative said he could not authorize a signature on an actively held contract. Vaughn told Brielle to get the bank on the phone. She said the hold would remain until either the review was completed or the authorized party withdrew the request. The authorized party was the man who had been handcuffed in the lobby 40 minutes ago and who was, by now, sitting in the back of a police vehicle. At the Redwood Harbor Police Station, things were developing in a direction that Bryce Langston had not anticipated when he filed the initial report. He had written it up and then sat with it in the way a person sits with something that does not quite close properly, rereading the parts that did not add up. The legal citation Weston had given him correctly, the contractual provision identified by title and date, the documentation that matched everything the man had said, and eventually he had gone to find his captain because the report was technically correct and practically wrong in a way that required a higher pay grade than his to resolve. Police Chief Garrett Holloway was in his late 50s, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that showed nothing at civic events, and everything to people who had worked alongside him for years. He had come up through municipal infrastructure enforcement before moving into law enforcement leadership, which made him unusual in the field and occasionally useful in ways nobody had planned for. When Bryce handed him the report and said the detained individual's name, Garrett stopped reading mid-sentence and looked up over the page. He asked Bryce to repeat it. Bryce said, "Weston Hale." Garrett set the paper down on his desk and walked to the holding room without explanation, and when he opened the door and saw the man sitting at the table with his forearms resting on the surface, and his expression unchanged from what it had presumably been in the lobby, he said simply, "Weston." And then, after a pause that held a great deal, "When did you come back into this?" Weston said he had never entirely left. He had just been quiet for a while. Garrett pulled a chair out and sat across from him, which was not standard procedure, and communicated to Bryce, standing in the doorway, that the situation had entered territory he should observe rather than manage. Garrett had first met Weston Hale 11 years earlier, during a joint investigation into a fraudulent bridge rehabilitation contract on the north side of the harbor that had involved falsified load assessments and had come within a reasonable margin of a structural failure that would have killed people. Weston had been a senior analyst for Hale Meridian Review at the time, and the technical documentation he had provided was so precise, so thoroughly sourced, and so impervious to legal challenge that it survived 3 separate attempts to discredit it and ultimately resulted in 2 criminal convictions and saved the city a liability exposure that the finance department had estimated at $40 million. Garrett had not forgotten this, because it was not the kind of thing a person forgets. A quiet man with a folder of numbers had walked into a room full of lawyers who wanted him to be wrong and had remained correct until being correct was impossible to argue with. He asked Weston why now, why today. Weston gave him the short version. The Southern Birth Zone had been part of an original community use agreement and the vocational center that his late wife Tessa had founded there. A place where people who had lost fishing jobs and dock work could train in electrical systems, equipment operation, and maritime maintenance, was on the verge of being permanently converted to private commercial infrastructure the moment that afternoon's contract was signed. He had sent letters of notice. He had filed preliminary objections through proper channels. None of them had been acknowledged. He had waited longer than he should have, partly because he had not wanted another long legal fight while June was still finishing school, and partly because he had told himself the process would correct itself, which was something he had known at the time was not true and had believed anyway, because believing it required less of him than the alternative. Garrett checked the documents and found them in order. He looked at Bryce. He said to start a supplementary report. Then Weston's phone rang, June checking in, and Weston answered and told her simply that things were fine and that he would explain when he could. She asked if this had something to do with what her mother had built. He paused, and then said he thought it had been time to keep a promise he had made a long time ago. The line was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet there was the particular understanding that exists between a parent and an adult child who has watched someone carry grief and principle in the same careful hands and knows the weight of both. The news moved faster than Von Mercer had planned for, and this surprised him because managing the speed of information was something he considered one of his core competencies. The bank's compliance hold had gone not only to Brielle Dawson, but to the institutional investors and the Port Operations Consortium as a matter of regulatory protocol, which meant that by 11 o'clock that morning the freeze on the bridge financing was no longer a private problem. It was a documented fact sitting in the inboxes of people whose obligations required them to act on it, rather than wait for Vaughn to explain it away. The port representative had excused himself from the 34th floor before noon. One of the institutional investors had his firm's general counsel on the phone before he had finished his coffee. The signing table that had been 45 minutes from completion when the morning began was now empty except for the untouched legal pads. Vaughn issued a communication statement describing the delay as a procedural clarification expected to be resolved within the business day and told Lawson to prepare a counterfiling challenging the standing of the Whitmore Clause on abandonment grounds. Lawson said he would prepare it, but that the legal threshold for establishing abandonment of a contractually embedded review right was substantially higher than Vaughn appeared to believe, and that the filing would require a minimum of 2 days to do properly. Vaughn said he did not have 2 days. Lawson said he understood that. The conversation ended with both men maintaining the fiction that they were still addressing the same problem from the same side of it. In the meantime, Autumn Rhodes had spent the better part of an hour going through the internal archive that Lawson's team maintained. She was looking for something specific, and she found it on her 41st attempt, a memo dated 14 months earlier in which Lawson had classified the Whitmore Clause as a negligible risk factor and recommended it be treated as functionally inactive without ever verifying that the co-founders' authorization codes had been canceled or that Hale Meridian had taken any action constituting formal dissolution. Below that memo, in a linked file, she found two versions of the Community Impact Assessment for the Southern Birth Zone. The original version, which had included 3 full sections on labor displacement and a detailed accounting of the Tessa Holloway Vocational Center and its role in the harbor community, and the amended version that had been submitted to the city, which reduced the entire subject to a single paragraph, noting that legacy community operations would be transitioned to alternative facilities. The transition plan referenced in that paragraph did not exist in any file she could locate. She brought this to Vaughn in person, placed the printouts on his desk, and told him what she had found without softening any part of it. He looked at the documents the way he looked at inconvenient weather, acknowledging the existence while declining to consider it personally relevant. He said Lawson handled those filings, and she should take it to Lawson. She said she had reason to believe Lawson had handled them in a manner that created material legal exposure for the entire organization, and that bringing it to the person who had created the exposure was not a reasonable path forward. Vaughn said she was overstating it. She said she did not believe she was. He asked what she thought he should do, and it was the first question he had asked in the entire conversation that did not carry its answer already embedded in it. She said release Weston's audit hold, log the documents in good faith, commission an independent review, and postpone the signing until the review was complete. Vaughn said that was not a plan but a capitulation. She said the alternative was litigating on falsified evidence with a frozen financing package and no signing partners at the table. He told her to leave the documents and return to her desk. She left the documents. She did not go to her desk. Instead, she went to the copy room, made a duplicate set, addressed an envelope to the City Infrastructure Authority's Director of Harbor Oversight, and sent it by registered courier. She did this without ceremony and without self-congratulation, because it was simply the thing that needed doing. The meeting Vaughn called that afternoon was described in his assistant's calendar as an alignment session, which was the organizational language used when the word confrontation needs to sound like something that had been planned in advance. He had sent word through Garrett Holloway that he wanted to meet with Weston in a private conference room on the 22nd floor. No lobby, no staff audience. And Weston had agreed and arrived with Garrett, who came in his personal capacity as a witness with a legitimate interest in how the morning's events would be characterized in the supplementary report now underway. Autumn Rhodes was already in the room when they arrived, which was not what Vaughn had arranged, but which Lawson chose not to object to, because objecting would have required explaining his reasons for wanting her excluded. Vaughn opened the meeting by acknowledging that the morning had been handled poorly in terms of optics, and then he offered Weston a settlement. A number delivered with the quiet confidence of a man who has learned that sufficiently large figures function as the resolution to most problems when applied directly enough. The number was, by any reasonable measure, a life-changing sum for a man who drove a 12-year-old pickup and lived in a rented house near the waterfront. Vaughn presented it not as a bribe, but as a recognition of inconvenience, which was a distinction he had found useful over the years. Weston looked at the figure on the page Lawson had placed in front of him. He looked at it long enough to register that it was real, and then he looked at Vaughn and said the issue had never been about money, and he said it in a way that was not righteous or performatively principled. Only factually accurate, the way someone states a coordinate. He said what Vaughn was building would eliminate the last functional public waterfront in Redwood Harbor. He said the people who came through the vocational center, the electricians, the dock equipment operators, The workers, who needed a second skill after the fishing industry contracted, had no legal team, no bank relationship, and no clause in any agreement that protected their access to the harbor, and that the documents in his folder had been that protection, and Vaughn's people had tried to arrest it at the door. Vaughn said that people who spoke about community almost always did so from the position of having nothing more substantial to lose, and that this was a pattern he had noticed across decades of doing business in working-class coastal cities, and the statement was precisely calibrated to demean, and it functioned as such. Weston looked at him without any particular change of expression, and said that a vision which required falsified reports to survive in the light was not a vision. It was greed wearing a blazer. The room was very quiet after that. Lawson slid the settlement pages closer. Weston picked them up, looked at them for 2 seconds, and tore them in half. Methodically, without drama, the way a person performs an irreversible act they have already decided on. He placed both halves flat on the table in 2 neat stacks. Lawson reached for them. Weston said the physical act of tearing was not legally meaningful, and Lawson was welcome to reassemble them, but the answer would remain the same. Vaughn said he had a legal team capable of sustaining litigation for a decade, and that he was prepared to deploy every available instrument against Weston to protect what he had built. Weston said he had heard that kind of statement before, usually from people who had confused the ability to spend money on a proceeding with the ability to make a true thing untrue, and that Vaughn could file whatever he chose to file. Autumn then said, into the stillness, that she had found the original and amended impact assessments in the company archive, and that the differences between them constituted a material misrepresentation of community impact in documents submitted to a regulatory authority. She said it directly to Vaughn rather than to Lawson, because the purpose was not to inform Lawson, who already knew, but to say it in front of witnesses while the opportunity existed. Lawson told her that her role did not include reviewing legal filings. She said that was accurate and that she had not been performing a legal review. She had been reading company documents she had access to. Vaughn told her to leave. She left. He told Lawson to deal with it. Lawson said he would handle it. Vaughn turned to Weston and said the lawsuit would be filed by Monday. Weston stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked out without looking back. Weston spent the following morning at a copy shop 2 blocks from the harbor, making complete duplicate sets of every document he had carried into Mercer Tower and every supplementary filing that Garrett Holloway had certified. He sent 1 set to the underwriting bank's legal compliance office by registered mail. He sent a second to the City Infrastructure Authority's Harbor Development Oversight Division. He sent a third to the board secretary of Mercer Dominion's governing board, with a cover letter describing the previous day's events, the basis for the clause activation, and the specific discrepancies between the original and amended impact assessments. He sent a fourth to a journalist he had known years earlier, who now covered infrastructure and urban development for a regional investigative outlet. The journalist called back in 40 minutes. He answered 3 questions and directed her to the documents. He said the documents would do more than he could, and he was right. The story ran the following evening. It was careful, precise, and organized around facts rather than drama. A man with a documented contractual right had attempted to file time-sensitive documents at a development company, had been removed and detained at the instruction of company leadership, and the project at stake was now under active audit review following the activation of a dormant oversight clause by the individual who had been handcuffed in the lobby. The story included side-by-side excerpts from the original and amended impact assessments. It included 3 requests for a statement from Mercer Dominion's communications office, and the office's non-response to all 3. By the following morning, the institutional investors had issued a formal call for a board meeting. The Port Operations Consortium had suspended participation pending audit completion. The underwriting bank had extended the compliance hold to include all Mercer Dominion accounts that shared the same banking relationship, which had the effect of freezing not just the harbor expansion, but several other development properties in the regional portfolio. The empire did not collapse in a single visible moment. It cracked along every place where Vaughn had substituted authority for accuracy, and the cracks spread in the way structural failures spread when a load-bearing element has been quietly compromised for a long time, slowly, and then all at once. Sterling Quinn, the board chair, flew back from New Mexico when the story broke and called an emergency session. He had been on the board for 9 years, had generally supported Vaughn's expansion strategy, and had never before had occasion to ask Vaughn to account for himself in the particular way that was now necessary. He called Vaughn before the meeting and said 3 things. The board needed Vaughn to voluntarily step back from operational decision-making. During the review, the bank would not unfreeze accounts while he remained in an active signing role, and this conversation was not a negotiation. Vaughn said his name was on the building. Sterling said that was accurate, and that his name would remain on the building, but his authority to make binding decisions for it would be paused until the compliance issue was resolved. Vaughn said that was unacceptable. Sterling said he understood, and that the vote would proceed regardless. That evening, Weston drove alone to the southern berth. He parked at the edge of the water where the old loading platforms were visible under algae and salt residue, walked to the building with the padlock rusted through from the inside, and stood before the sign that read Tessa Holloway V. Associational Center in letters that had once been blue and were now mostly gray. He did not do anything in particular. He simply stood in the place where his wife had taught people who needed a new beginning how to use their hands to build one, and he thought about the night she had drawn diagrams on a paper bag and laughed at him for pointing out that her electrical schematics were not technically to scale, and about how the person who draws with that kind of love for something is rarely the kind of person who should be erased from a place to make room for a marina for yachts. His phone rang. June. He told her he had read the article and that the next few days would sort themselves out, and she told him in the direct way she had always had that she was proud of him, and that she was also fairly sure their mother would have had precise and pointed things to say about how long it had taken him to get here. He said that her mother had always known exactly where the right thing was and exactly how far away he was from standing on it. Vaughn Mercer held his press event in the ground floor conference room of Mercer Tower the following morning at 10 o'clock. He had written his opening remarks himself, which was unusual. He normally had communications staff handle those, and it showed in the way the statement combined genuine grievance with selective omission in proportions that were not quite balanced enough to carry the weight he was asking them to carry. He intended to describe what had happened as a coordinated effort by anti-development interests to obstruct a project that would have generated hundreds of jobs and significant tax revenue for Redwood Harbor. He intended to characterize Weston as a motivated opponent acting on personal grievance. He intended to announce an imminent civil action. He did not reach the second sentence of his prepared remarks. A reporter raised her hand and asked whether he was aware that the board had voted at 9:15 that morning to suspend his signing authority pending the completion of the compliance review. Vaughn looked at the microphone. He looked at the reporter. He said that the board's internal deliberations were not a matter for a press conference. She read aloud the public statement the board had issued 23 minutes earlier, and the room shifted in the way rooms shift when the ground under the person at the front of it has visibly moved. The photographers adjusted what they were capturing. The tenor of the questions changed. Sterling Quinn appeared in the room, uninvited, present, and stepped to the microphone. He said, with the practiced evenness of a man completing a difficult task professionally, that Mercer Dominion was committed to full cooperation with the audit review, that the harbor expansion project was suspended pending independent examination, and that Lawson Drake had been placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation into the document discrepancies that had come to light. He said the detention of the previous day had been an error in judgment, and that the company regretted it. He looked briefly toward the back of the room. Weston was there, near the wall, hands in his pockets, wearing the same jacket. He had not come to speak, and had not come to be photographed. He had come because Autumn had told him the board intended to include a statement about the vocational center, and he wanted to hear it in person rather than secondhand, because some things deserved to be witnessed. Sterling announced that the Southern Berth Zone would include a formally designated community use area as part of the restructuring process, and that the vocational center building would be restored and rededicated under its original name, and that a community oversight council would be established to advise on all future harbor development decisions. Vaughn was standing to the left of the podium. He had not moved. He looked across the room at Weston with the particular searching quality of a man looking for evidence that something has been personal. Satisfaction, vindication, the score-settling expression of a man who fought and won, and he did not find it. He found a man who looked tired and composed and ready to leave, because the thing that needed to be done had been done, and Weston had never been oriented toward what happened after. Vaughn came toward him and said, low, near the wall, that Weston had destroyed something built over decades over one old building and a matter of principle. Weston said that was one reading. He said another reading was that Vaughn had built it on the assumption that the people who stood in his way could either be bought or handcuffed into silence, and that this had worked until it met someone who was neither for sale nor capable of being silenced by procedure. Brielle Dawson, passing on her way to the exit, paused at Weston's shoulder and said quietly that the restructuring framework he had outlined, the vocational center, the community oversight council, the open waterfront access provisions, was the only proposal the bank was willing to accept as a condition of unfreezing the accounts, and that she had run the numbers and it worked, and she said it, not as an apology, but as the acknowledgement that a financial officer makes when the right answer turns out to have been available the entire time. 3 months after the day Weston Hale was handcuffed in the lobby of Mercer Tower, Redwood Harbor looked different at the waterfront. Not louder or more expensive, not the way development usually changes a place, but in the way a place looks when something that was going away comes back. The Southern Berth Zone had been fenced off for renovation. The old loading platforms were being repaired. The building that had been locked and gray for too long now had fresh paint on the letters above the door. Tessa Hollolai Technical Hall, in the original blue. Inside, a newly hired program director was coordinating the first enrollment session for an electrical systems training course with 12 registered students. Most of them workers displaced when the cannery on the north end had shut down the previous spring. Weston was one of the instructors. He had not planned to be, but the program director had asked in a way that was genuinely difficult to refuse, and June had told him it was exactly the kind of work he was built for, and eventually he had said yes. He drove the pickup to the hall 3 mornings a week and taught what Tessa had taught him to value: precision, patience, the understanding that any system can be understood if you are willing to be honest about what you do not yet know. He did not bring up Von Mercer. He did not talk about the morning in the lobby, the phone call, the frozen accounts, or any of the rest of it. He just taught. Von Mercer had resigned from operational control of Mercer Dominion 6 weeks after the board vote. He had not been arrested, and he had not been left with nothing. He retained his personal wealth and a reduced ownership stake, and Sterling Quinn had installed a new executive team with a mandate to rebuild the compliance infrastructure from the ground up. Lawson Drake had resigned and was under investigation by the State Bar Association. Autumn Rhodes had been brought onto the Oversight Committee as the company's ethics liaison, a new title created because the board had agreed the role was necessary and she had already been performing it without being asked. The Empire still existed. It had been forced by documents and deadlines and one telephone call placed under supervision in a glass lobby to become something it had not previously been, accountable. June came home for a long weekend in November. On Saturday morning early, she and Weston walked down to the hall before the students arrived. She stood in front of the building and looked at the sign for a long time without speaking. She said their mother would have had a detailed list of changes she wanted made to the paint color, the placement of the lettering and the spacing between the words. Weston said that was accurate. June said she also would never have admitted, not once, that any of it looked right. He laughed quietly, and then he looked at the sign and the building and the harbor stretching behind it, cold and gray and its own, and said it looked right to him. The lobby of Mercer Tower had a new notice board on the eastern wall, placed there by the Community Oversight Council as part of the restructuring agreement. It listed the intake dates for vocational training programs across the harbor zone. One morning, a guard newly assigned to the building watched a man in a worn jacket and paint-stained boots walk through and stop to read the board. The guard moved toward him on instinct. A senior staff member touched the guard's arm before he could speak. She said, "Don't judge anyone by the jacket they're wearing." This building had nearly lost everything because of exactly that habit. Weston heard her say it on his way back to the door. He stepped out into the harbor air, salt and cold, and the distant sound of equipment running somewhere across the water, and walked back to the truck. The same jacket, the same man who had walked into that lobby on a rainy morning with a folder in a plastic bag and been laughed at by a man who could not imagine that someone who looked like nothing could be carrying everything that mattered. Von Mercer had laughed when the handcuffs went on, certain that a single father with scuffed boots and no visible power had no means to reach him. But Weston Hale had never needed to raise his voice or his fists. He had needed only one call, and the truth had done the rest.
Shit. I don't know, which way should I go? This way? Yahoo! Go up top. Focus on a different game. They released a trailer for it, but you forgot. Is it like this? Is it like Wukong? That's cool. Might be a masterpiece. What's up, Eddie? How you doing, bro? This game is so good, bro. You are right. It's a great game. I watched you when you first played Red Dead 2. What's up, bro? How you doing today, Sock? Welcome in, brother man. How you been?